Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Series 7 of the Climate Pioneers Show. This series, we are focused on a topic I love, hiring and building teams. Hiring people is the most important thing that you will do as a founder, and how you build out your early stage team is absolutely crucial because it sets that foundation upon which the rest of your business will grow. And across the course of this series, we are speaking to founders, investors, coaches, and specialists from across the full spectrum of HR and talent to give you access to valuable insights and advice as you build your team. And today we are going to be covering the topic of employer brand, which is such an important foundation to growing a business. If you can create a culture that people love working in, and you know how to communicate that effectively to prospective employees, then your recruitment will be so much easier and you'll be able to attract and, most importantly, retain the very best talent. And today I'm joined by Quinn, a specialist in working with businesses to craft irresistible employer brands and employee experiences. Graham also works as a partner to Flexa, the company helping people find flexible work, and he works with Flexa-listed companies to improve their employer brands. He's got an absolute wealth of knowledge to share in this topic. In fact, prior to us going live, he actually warned me that he could talk about this all day. So strap in, I'm expecting big things. But we're going to dig into how early stage founders particularly can be mindful right from the outset about how they're building and communicating their brand. So Graham, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me here. It's my pleasure.
My pleasure. So, right, let's get started with the basics, because I'm really conscious that I don't want to throw too much jargon around that people might not know. You and I are both in the talent space, the recruitment space. So terms like employer value proposition, EVP, employer brand, they're kind of second nature to us. But so everybody's listening starts out on the same page. Can you just give us the idiot's guide, right? What is employer brand? What is EVP? How are the two different? And why do they matter?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the first thing is, everyone gets, I think there's an old adage with employer branding that I think recruiters have been doing it for years now. And really what they've really been doing is just posting jobs on social media and calling it employer branding. But yeah, so in its simplest form, employer branding is really your reputation you have as an employer among your employees and the workforce. It's how you market yourself to both talent and internal employees alike. And it just doesn't start from attraction. It starts from a hire to essentially retire. And coming out of that, your EVP really is your employer value proposition. So it's that unique offering you offer. Yeah, your unique offering, that you offer as an employer to your employees in return for their skills, experience, and really the commitment to your company. So under that, it could cover your compensation, your career development opportunities, your culture, your work-life balance, and purpose and mission. And how your EVP structured is you have your EVP pillar, so your overall promise, and then it's broken up into 3 to 5 pillars that really drives how what you give and what you get in return for that. Yeah, and I guess really why it's really important. I can throw out statistics, but keeping to its guide, really why it matters is because you're essentially designing that shop front. What it's like to work at your company, both with your shop window, which is your external, your employer brand. And then the inside of your shop is your internal employer brand across your employee experience. So it's really important to deliver an experience that is honest and authentic to really attract the right talent to join. And really in a nutshell, it's how you'll improve your experience, better retain your employees, boost employee engagement, support career development, and really better attract talent as a whole. Yeah, and I think, it's been around for a while, and now we're starting to see more of it become more familiar. In Canada, I like to say, still in its infant stages. It's like that pre-teen. The US, it's been around for a while. It's late teens, and in Europe, it's similar. It's early 20s. So it's been around for a while, but you're starting to see more countries really take advantage of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Perfect. That was a really helpful summary. So just to kind of boil that down, EVP is the offering that you give the people that work for you. So what do they get in return for coming and working hard? The EVP is what they get for that.
Exactly.
So some might say your culture ultimately, right? And I suppose they're different, but yeah, synonymous. And then employer brand is the shop window. It's how you present what that employer value proposition is to the world. Okay. Perfect. And so this podcast, as I said, at the outset, is aimed at early stage founders, right? Early stage startup founders. And I'm sure that a lot of people see employer brand as being something only bigger companies really think about. When your company's big enough, you've got a whole department that looks after that, right? But for these really early stage companies, when you're literally a founder with a really small team, say you've got like maybe 10 people or less, it's employer brand's probably quite far down on your list of priorities, because you're worrying about like existential things like, can I get enough funding and can I build this product and actually get some money for it? But I would argue it's never too early to start thinking about this stuff if you're intentional about building a big company. So what do you think there? How early is too early to start thinking about it? When should they start putting these kind of building blocks in place? And what would the earliest iteration of that, do you think, start to look like?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that, like you mentioned, I wouldn't say it's never too early to do employer branding, and I wouldn't even say it's only for bigger companies. Obviously, when you are a bigger company, you have a lot more resources and support. That being said, if you're a team of 1 to a team of 10, or even to 200, I've worked in a startup before where I was the only one leading it across doing recruitment as well. So whether you're big or small, you're both competing for talents. You're perhaps the same caliber of talents. Especially with your early stage startup. Maybe you're in the tech sphere, you need software engineers, you need product managers. Now the level of priority will obviously be wildly different for both, like you mentioned. So I think is there really a time when it is too early to think about it? And I really don't think so. At the very least, you're learning how to create a strong online brand presence as a founder. Then that will really help out in 2 ways. It'll boost your product awareness and like who you are and what you're trying to make and what you're trying to sell, essentially. Simultaneously help build your employer brand as well. And it's really that old adage of like small steps. Now, if you're going to be growing quickly in the future as well, I think it's a great time to start, because if you're starting to think more seriously about it, you may not have created your values yet. You can build a careers page or any profile and reputation platform, and that will be overwhelming. But I think even like building the most simplest and basic career site can really help get you started.
Yeah.
But I also know for a company of 10 people, building a career site's not going to be a priority. And I think though it comes to the whole point of like, if you have a website, then at least put like a 1 page and just call it your career site, because it will help with your SEO efforts. I think start there and leave it there until you have more capacity and really develop a more established culture. And obviously, as you grow, your culture will change over time. And it won't make sense to be changing it at every turn or every like new round of funding. From a team of 10 to a team of 20, your culture will change vastly. Previous company I worked at, the culture started with you join the company and you build your own desk. And that really changed to having a visa and culture team, a relocation team. So obviously culture changes throughout the company as it grows. And I think we can build the most really during these early stages is really starting to put pen to paper figuratively and building out your processes, culture, your benefits, your ways of working, and sharing that transparently, and linking it to your career site. So maybe it's like maybe it's a Notion page or something, and just linking it. And like I mentioned, like Notion works excellently for this. And that link will stay the same, and you could build onto it over time. But at least you have that career site or career page to really bring things forward.
Perfect. Awesome. And I think you kind of alluded to this at the beginning when you were describing the difference there between employer value proposition and employer brand. And you said, one is what's going on inside the shop and one's the shop window. And I think one of the problems with employer brand can sometimes be companies treat it like a fantasy marketing project, right? And they're dressing the shop window without really thinking about what's happening inside the shop. And thinking about how they want to be perceived, or what would look really good. What should a company like us be saying, rather than who really are we? And the reality often doesn't chime with what it really feels like inside the shop. What's your advice there? Where do you see companies get this stuff wrong? And if somebody's not started any of this at all and they're really early in their thinking, how can they start building from a position of reality, right?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought this up, because I think I've seen this quite a bit throughout my career, and it always boggles my mind like why this is the case. Whenever I look at companies and interact with companies, I look at them and the employer brand through 3 like sand bucket approach, really. In the first bucket, you have companies like this. They treat it as putting lipstick on a pig, trying to cover up a terrible work culture, to really appear more desirable to talent. It's like, we know we have terrible culture. How can we spice it up, essentially? And then within that second bucket, you have companies who aren't even aware of what employer branding is or can experience or what an EVP is and are unintentionally doing an amazing job. They often fly below the radar and remain the status quo. And then lastly, with that third SAM bucket, you have companies who are really aware to what employer branding and employee experience is and are open to having someone come in and really build that up for them to accurately portray their culture and really help attract talents. Now, how do we start with the reality? I think during the building of your EVP, during that research and discovery phase, you're going to be interviewing people internally with different levels of seniority, backgrounds, locations, if you're global, to really get their honest take on what it's like to work there, both the good and the bad. And I think the answers coming out of this may not be what you envisioned. Obviously, when you're a founder or like a leader, you have your own vision of what culture is. I mean, let's be clear, culture is not like a top-down mentality of like culture is what I say it is. Because it's culture is the lived experiences of every employee.
Yeah.
So if it's not matching with what you thought it was like, let's take a step back and understand what went wrong and what needs to be done to fix it, or maybe where we're 2 lanes over from where we want the culture to be. And I think a lot of the time when we're doing these research stages, employee engagement surveys as well, we're asking a lot of employees to share their honest feedback through these surveys. And if we're not actioning on it or improving upon the feedback, then that will only hamper your opportunities and really take a mental toll on employees and really increase that attrition. So I think it's really just about taking the research, seeing what the research tells you to do, or what's right, what's wrong, and then going from there to create that culture that really aligns with your EVP.
And to build the truest picture, I'm thinking in a small company, right, where there isn't much remove between the founder and the rest of the team. And you don't have a people team or an HR department that could do this as a sort of remover, a separate, make it anonymous, for example. It can be really exposing for people, to be honest. And I think often if it's the founder thinking, right, I'll sit down with all 10 of my people, are you ever really going to get the truest, most unbiased view on what your culture really is? Because despite the fact that you might think you're creating this really psychologically safe environment full of transparency, is somebody really going to sit in front of you and tell you all the things that are wrong with your leadership or the company? Probably not, because they might think that they might lose their job. So in those smaller and even if you send out like an anonymous survey, if there's only 5 of you, it can be pretty obvious whose response is whose.
Yeah.
So would you advise in those smaller organizations some form of remove, like bringing in somebody external, some kind of third party, using some kind of a tool to do this with that gives you that really unbiased reality?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Honestly, I think it's challenging even if you're a startup to a large multinational. Like, if you're the Amazon of the world, you're still not going to get, people are very hesitant to give their honest feedback in these surveys to begin with. And I think even if you are like a team of 5, in this early startup phases, it's even more important of like, well, like you mentioned, I don't want to lose my job.
Yeah.
And I think you could do it 2 ways. I think you could work with an external party and really try and gauge that insight into your culture and try and build it from there. But at the same time too, I don't know if it's practical, depending, if you're trying to get funding and whatnot, then you are a small team of 5, there might just not be that priority to do it. And so it becomes from a point of like, yeah, you want to have a psychologically safe culture, but it's not feasible to do it when you're doing everything from A to Z. And that just kind of comes with time. And so I think maybe an option there is to really think, okay, well, we know people are maybe hesitant to offer their feedback. Maybe let's just make it a brainstorming session in terms of like what we envision the culture is and what we want it to be. And agree to disagree or agree to compromise, and at least have that collaborative nature, because as you're building a product, you're going to have disagreements all the time. And so it's like, let's just make another session to focus on who we are as a company and what our culture is. And I think it removes that stigma of, if I speak up, I'm going to be targeted, essentially.
Yeah. I like that idea. So almost treating the culture like a product in and of its own, that as a small founding team, you all have a joint responsibility in building. And so that you treat the building and the brainstorming around how you create that in the same way that you would a product. So you critique each other and you give honest feedback. And yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too, because when you think about employer branding now today, a lot of people from outside of the industry are looking at HR and saying, well, why don't we make HR a product? It's the same as, it's the same as an app. You have product managers, you have engineers, you just go through the whole end-to-end process of research, user experience, and whatnot. So I've been seeing a lot of posts where people are like, hey, like I've had this great idea, like why don't we look at our employee experience as building products? And then you kind of have to chime in being like, well, employer brand and employee experience practitioners have been doing this for a while. It's what we're doing. But we just don't have the money, or we don't have the resources that product teams have. We have to do everything from social media engagements to brand management to developing video and creative. It's like social media back in 5 years ago when you're told to do everything. And so there is a really great notion towards people wanting to make the human experience more like a product, because it is essentially. But I think there's that gap in understanding of product teams always have more time, resources, budget than employer branders. And so there is that disconnect, but I think a lot of people are seeing that you can still, even if you are like an early stage startup, you can take this employer brand and make it more of a product and do it the same way, because you'll get the same results, and it'll just put you in a different mindset of like, okay, what do people see when they join, or what do they get, and how can we make it a better experience for them?
Yeah. There's that puts me to mind of a book actually. Do you know Jessica Zvan?
I don't think so.
No. So she was the COO at Whereby, the video conferencing platform, and she now works at Talentful. She's in the senior leadership C-suite there, but she's written a book about that very concept, about the people function as a product. I'll try and find the name for it and put it in the chat, but yeah, it's a good book. And we talked there, you mentioned those kind of 3 buckets of companies and how they approach this, and whether or not it's a fantasy marketing project or not. And I think sometimes when we do the reality check and go internally and look at the culture, like you said, sometimes it will be not necessarily what you want it to be. Or sometimes you'll realize you are a certain way and you're not for everybody, right? And you kind of, I think, as part of this, have to be clear about who you're not for as much as who you are for. And I think sometimes people think that employer brand is about wanting to get everybody to come and work for you. And it's not really, is it? It's about getting the right people to want to come and work for you. So yeah, what are your thoughts? I mean, how would you speak to that, and where do you see people do that well, and how can people start to think about who are we not for as much as who we are for?
Yeah, definitely. I think this is one of the greatest issues within our industry as a whole. Charlotte Marshall and Bryan Adams, not that Bryan Adams, coins the phrase give and get, so repel the many and compel the few. So the notion of candidates understand they must give something to receive something in return. And as a result, you don't want everyone to work for you. It's unsustainable. It's unsustainable from a recruitment perspective. It's unsustainable to employer brand practitioners to market to everyone. This whole notion of like everyone wants to work for us, we get thousands of applications all the time, isn't the flex people think it is, or they make you believe. I've interviewed with companies before, and they're like, oh, like sometimes applications fall through the hole. We're such a great company, we have so many applications, and that tells me the opposite story of why people. It's just a complete dissociative state of mind of like why you don't want to be the fit for everyone. And I think right now you see a lot of companies saying, oh, we want to be the employer of choice. And you're like, okay, great. Like, let's specify that. Like, employer of choice for who? For software talent, for engineering talent, for marketers, for, employer of choice is so broad. You can't be it for everyone and at the same time be unique. Ferrari isn't out there trying to be the family van for families, nor is their USP exclusive. Their USP is exclusivity, performance, and quality cars based on successful sporting. Ford, you're not going to get a Ferrari person in a Ford. And you see this a lot, and it's all the more reason when you start building your employer brand, you understand how you differ from your competitors, and really what makes you unique, and then lead with that and throughout your employer brand efforts. You'll find will be more successful for you in the long run with retention, engagement, and it'll make it easier for you to be laser focused on who you are and what you do versus spreading yourself out too thin to really appeal to the masses. And I think the way you can do this as well is in job ads, describe the type of person who wouldn't do well in the role. If it's a fast-paced environment for a lot of these startups, say, you're not going to survive here. I mean, better wording, but you're not going to do well here if you're here for a 9-to-5 job. We work hard, we have high ambitions, and you really want to describe that culture in an honest and authentic way to really help see if it's the right fit for people.
Yeah. Now that's so interesting, because I think then it's really, I suppose it's really complicated to figure out how you do that well and how you marry that with being inclusive and driving diversity, because the two almost seem kind of, there's like a tension between the two, right? And of course it's possible to do the two, because obviously you still want a team that's representative of the outer world, right, of the world at large, and you still want to create an environment where people, no matter what their background, feel like they're a valid member of the team. And you can do that whilst also being honest about who you're not for. But I think it's quite messy to do that and to do it well. Yeah. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think you make a great point too, because it's one of those things where, we're seeing this right now with hybrid remote work opportunities. And yeah, you can say that hybrid is better for the culture. And you're like, well, being in like a cubicle environment 2-3 days a week isn't going to do much for my culture than sitting at home. People are transitioning from fully remote working to hybrid, and they won't work for a certain percentage. And, that's okay. But at the same time too, you have to look at, why are people working remote? Why do people have that flexibility? Maybe they're caregivers, maybe they're parents, maybe they have disability or accessibility needs, and it's being easier for them to be at home. Someone who is neurodiverse prefers a quiet environment, and they can't get that at the office. And so I think at this point too, it's like, people are saying, well, let's lean into it. We're going to share our working style is, and if people can't do fully remote, then they'll select themselves out. And if it's not a fit, again, it's okay. But at the same time too, it's like, okay, but how do we also get those people that we want, like parents and caregivers and disability folks? So it is quite the challenge. And I think it's one of those things where, how do you do it honestly and authentically, but at the same time to not be stepping on over any toes? And yeah, I think it's quite the challenge. And I think by the time, overall, at the end of the day, by the time a candidate applies for a role, they should have enough information to self-determine if it's the right place for them. And if you don't have an accessibility policy, or your accessibility policy is performative, and you say we're fully in office, then yes, that's going to exclude a whole variety of people who have needs that require them to be remote or flexible. At the same time too, it's this more approach of like, this is our culture, and if you don't fit with it, great. And it kind of goes also into like, is it a culture add or culture fit that the company is hiring for?
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, it is a conundrum, and one that requires a lot of thought. And yeah, it's interesting to see how people do it, and that mindset shift from, okay, but I thought I'd been told I have to be for everyone because I'm supposed to create this really inclusive environment. Now I'm being told I shouldn't be for everyone. So how do I position that? But yeah, interesting. And when I was researching for this episode, I read a post of yours. I think it was quite a long time ago now on LinkedIn, but it really made me laugh, where you had you'd kind of written a post kind of coming at those companies in a way, in a tongue-in-cheek kind of a way, who have those kind of sweary bro type slogans to describe their culture. So like, we get shit done, like, don't be a dick, those kind of like really trying to shock people kind of slogans. And you said, this says a lot about a company without having to say much at all. So yeah, you tell me your take on that, because it made me laugh. When you're reading between the lines, what does that tell you about a company? And how can companies maybe start to, because I think there's a lot of jargon, cliche-ish type language that comes into this stuff where companies think they're being really unique or really out there or really disruptive or really bold. What are some ways that you think they can convey that same thing without being like that?
Yeah, I mean, I also don't think there is such a bad thing as saying it that way either. I'll go into that a bit later, but I think this whole notion, I remember seeing companies mention it. I've seen it on their career sites. I've seen it posted as a value on a wall. It came from really experiences where companies have these in place. To me personally, it's a very immature company culture without proper safeguards, leadership, or policies, and a very homogeneous team, like drink the Kool-Aid style atmosphere. To put it in British terms, it's like a lads culture. It's like a jock culture. It's possibly where toxic masculinity is in a place, with fragile egos, and you challenge leadership in just like a constructive way to say, hey, we thought about doing this instead of this, or have we looked into doing this? It's kind of like a culture where it's not psychologically safe to be in, from my personal perspective. When you get hired, everyone knows you're there to do a job to the best of your ability, be kind and professional to everyone, and be collaborative. Like it's not rocket science. You don't need to spell it out. You don't, let alone have these values painted on the wall. And you really have to wonder if all employees had a say on what these values should be, or if it was, the selected few. And especially like in startups or small companies, it could be like, we're developing our values, and then only 5 people of a 50-person team are interviewed about the values, and it's a select 5 who are close to the CEO, the founder, managing director, and so forth. I think you'll find values like this that attract a very specific type of crowd. People early on in their career or just starting out. They don't have the best for having a wide spectrum of experiences to rely on, and help reach your products, get new funding levels for sure. And yes, maybe you'll have a great time at work, but is it really equitable and inclusive? Or are the values actionable and beyond surface level? If they are, then that's where I want to join. So I don't know if it's a unique thing. Like personally, I would see it and run away. But I don't necessarily think there's a bad thing to it, depending on how you look at it.
Well, maybe they know who they are for, and they know who they're not for, and they're not for you.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's exactly that. Like, the negative connotations are okay. Like, if that's who you are, be unapologetic about it. If that's your culture, what you stand for, who you really want to attract. Like, you don't want to take, again, like the everything to everyone approach. You want to be unique and separate yourself from the noise. And obviously that is definitely one way to do it. Doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It's what works best for them, but they should also understand that too. And it will attract a much more narrow pool of talent. And I think that really drives the question, like, how does this translate to the culture they created? Are they, again, diverse with a psychologically safe culture and everyone can thrive? Or do they create a toxic environment where inadequate leadership, policies, and favoritism ran rampant? And I think that's where we should really focus.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And in terms of time, bandwidth, time, the amount of time this takes to do this well, right? And we alluded at the beginning of this episode to the fact that founders, especially in early stage teams, are really limited in time. If you don't have a dedicated people function that's owning this and driving this, and you as the founder are having to do it amongst myriad other responsibilities, like I said, it gets kind of chucked to the back. But what are the kind of quick, dirty, hacky, easy things that founders can start doing early that builds this into their mindset, that makes this part of how they review their business on a daily, weekly, monthly basis? It becomes part of how they're marketing their business and the things that they're putting out on LinkedIn. You mentioned one great point earlier, which was about the Notion site. So rather than doing a big careers page, maybe just having a page on Notion that you iterate and evolve over time. But yeah, perhaps more on that. And then other things that founders can be doing, these like quick, dirty, hustly things early on to like get it in there.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things, especially with like Notion. I've seen really great use cases for it, and especially when it comes to startup environments. It's better to be transparent. So share what your policies, your values, how you hire, what your vacation policy is, like what's your ways of working, who's a good fit, who isn't a good fit. Use it to speak to your culture, your hiring practices, and share your employee handbook. It's not going to be in depth, and there are templates out there, which I'll go into a bit, but you're really bringing people in and showing them what it's like to work there, who best succeeds, who doesn't, and what you can get in return. So I think to capitalize on building your employer brands, using Notion will deliver monumental results over traditional methods. And it doesn't require any special skills, coding, design. Like, you just throw an emoji and whatnot. Yeah, and so I think in early stage founders, like, you don't have time and resources. You can easily craft it. I do want to shout out though to Adam and John at Open.org. They're developing a great resource library full of Notion templates for anyone in the people and culture space can utilize, especially fast growing startups. But yeah, I think overall it's one of those things where there's so much you can do that's so easy on such a small level. Create a blog post, LinkedIn post, or anything, just sharing your founding story or the values you hold or you try and emulate as a company.
Yeah.
It's not going to be a lot if you have a small company, but share employee testimonials as well of like what it's like to work there, how the benefits are perceived by employees, or how growth is supported. Build content for helpful job seekers, like what problem are you trying to solve for, what skills are needed, or what does your interview process look like if one were to apply. And I think it's so easy for stuff like this to connect it back to Notion or vice versa. And again, like sharing it wider, build employee advocacy to get your employees to share about the products and what it's like working at your company. And again, you're doing that dual service of building awareness as who you are as a company from an employer brand standpoint, but also this is who we are, this is what we're building.
Yeah.
And again, connected to that, like engage your thought leadership content either by posting or joining talks or panel discussions or really fireside chats. Yes, I think there's a lot of things that can be done, and I think it's just easy to be shared or promoted on social media channels or through other mediums. Like no one's expecting it to be perfect and beautifully designed, but that raw and authentic style could really be more powerful to what could succeed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that works really nicely, especially when you've got a really small team, is literally, and I've done this a few times, but like on a Friday, just do a post. What have we done this week? Like, what did we as a team do this week? Where did we go? What did we work on? What problem did we solve? What client we were working with? And it gives a real like under the bonnet, under the hood look at what does it feel like to work for you in what's a week in the life in this company. And tell me about the kind of intersection, or your thoughts on the intersection between personal brand and employer brand, because you mentioned there about the founder story, a blog post on the founder story. And often in early stage companies, the founder persona and the company can be quite conflated. And I think that the founder's own personal brand, often you're coming to work for that person. And the culture you believe that person will therefore create. So how important in those early days is founder personal brand and weaving that in?
I think it's super important. I want to start off with the story here is, especially going back to your previous point, LinkedIn is a fantastic platform to start to build a brand from doing it steadily and consistently. In fact, connecting personal brand, employer brand, I remember, COVID times, watching Amelia Sordell really build clout from the ground up during COVID to the blooming agency it is today. It's all through building her presence on the platform. She was very much a one-woman show, and now she's running a successful agency in London. Like, that just goes to show you how powerful LinkedIn is, but also the intersection between personal brand and employer brands. But I think the old adage here is true. People buy products from people, and they're more likely to buy for someone they know, like, and trust. And so that's true whether you're selling them as your service product or your employer brand. And there's numerous studies and experiments out there to really show that personal brand delivers monumental engagement over a company's brands. I did get 2 statistics for that. So social media today found that posts shared by employees have 800% more engagement than the same posts shared by official brand accounts. A good example of this as well is There was recently a post by Bolts, the transportation company out in Estonia, who shared two posts from, it was just like a dog going into the office type culture video, and people's like employees posts saw more engagement for brands' actual accounts. And Magazine Entrepreneur as well found that 83% of business owners say that a strong personal brand has helped them attract new talents or clients, and grow their business. And you have to ask yourself like why. And it's again, people trust people more than they trust brands.
Yeah.
So I think there's that intersection there, but at this founder as well, you're increasing again awareness in a multitude of ways, from your products to your employer brands to your own personal brands. And how you measure it can be as simple as measuring engagement, reaction to comments. There's other tools out there that you can use as well, like Shield. Or it could be as complex as calculating earned media value and seeing how much you saved in building your personal brands, doing it organically versus paid. But again, is it practical early on for founders who have a million other things to do? It depends. Like, it's as much as you put into it. And, I try and build my own personal brand on LinkedIn, do 2-3 posts a week. But again, like it could fall back. And I think that just the thing to think about is consistency, and really driving that is just doing it consistently on a regular basis, whether you're sharing stuff about your products or your personal brand, will really grow. And
and like you said, it'll affect other. It's not just for employer brand, is it? Like you said, it'll help them win customers. It'll help, I'm sure that if they're looking for investment and they're speaking to VCs, that's one of the things that they'll look in when they're doing due diligence on them. It helps them to get speaking engagements if they're putting thought leadership pieces out. Yeah, all this stuff helps on a kind of larger holistic level. And then employer brand and showing the culture and the type of manager you are is part of that. Just to your point about, you talked about a story there, you mentioned Amelia. Another example of where I've seen personal brand really help with recruitment was a company that I did some work for, an early stage startup, doing phenomenal, amazing things in the climate space, but still fairly early stage. Not many people necessarily had heard of them, and they were looking to recruit software engineers to come and join them. But the person that they had hired as their head of engineering was somebody who had a really great personal brand in the engineering space, written books, undertook speaking engagements, was really well thought of. And the amount of conversations I had with people that applied for that job who never would have applied for the job, perhaps if that person hadn't been the manager, that was saying, I would go anywhere. It's not about the company. Yes, they're doing something really cool and impactful, but I just want to work wherever they are because I want to work for that person. And that's so, and I think when we talk about founder personal brand, the founder thinks perhaps it maybe all has to come from them, but I think maybe empowering the level below as well to build their personal brands, because it all compounds.
100%. And I've previously joined companies where I've met people in the industry and knew that, like, I've seen them post on LinkedIn. I was like, oh, you know what, this person, like, I trust that they know what they're talking about. And I think that's really hard to gauge nowadays with LinkedIn, how everyone's like a LinkedIn influencer. Like, it's so hard to differentiate between like who's genuine and who actually practices what they preach internally, or if it's just more for show. But I've joined companies where I've said, oh, I know these two people, I really want to work for them, and that's driven me to work for a certain company because I thought that they were hiring there. But on the flip side as well, like, I worked at an agency previously, and we got a lot of business through, surprisingly, Glassdoor, because they saw the culture that we had and were reading reviews from employees, and both, obviously there was the good and the bad. We had still a relatively high score, I think about 4.4 or 4.6. But they're like, we would get inbound business from that because they saw how well the culture we had, and they said, we want to work with people who have a great culture and who really practice what they preach, and we saw that through your reviews. And so it really added to our, I guess, business development pipeline, but at the same time too, it really drove the impact of branding, whether it's personal brand or even your employer brand.
Yeah, that's really interesting you mentioned that, because that's one of the things I was going to ask you, actually. I do some work with clients of mine when I go in and do recruiting projects. If they've got a team, one of the things I will often offer is that I will kind of go in and speak to the members of that team before I start the hiring. And if they don't have much of a Glassdoor presence, I will almost take a verbal Glassdoor reference, right, from people in their team, and then help encourage to get those put on there so that they start to build a really good, a good shop front really of what it's like to work there. But the pushback I sometimes get is, yeah, but nobody looks at those. Oh, no one really looks at Glassdoor, do they? Is it that important? Like, should we bother? So interesting that you say in that case they did. I mean, do you have other proof that or why else, I suppose, would you back that it's worth companies putting their effort into in some way trying to encourage or incentivize people to create Glassdoor?
Yeah, it's a good question, which is getting tricky nowadays. I think, Glassdoor really changed their user interface and it kind of made people less appealing to it. I think as a very base level, founders should create a profile on Glassdoor just for the whole notion of, same with LinkedIn, just the whole notion of that, like, no one goes, you don't have like 3 different company profiles that are similar because there's a common one and not the other, type thing. The thing is, though, too, is it's so heavily weighted too. If you're a small company and you only have 10 people, like those 10 reviews will be monumental compared to if you're 200, and so your change will fluctuate wildly. At the same time, too, I think the issue with Glassdoor is, again, every company sees this. You're going to have more negative reviews than positive reviews. But I think what's hard to differentiate, or what's easy to differentiate, is that there's a common thread between all of them. So if everyone keeps saying, oh, great pay, great culture, and there's 1 or 2 where it's like, oh, this person wasn't great to work for, then yeah, you're probably just like take away the bad leadership. But everyone goes to at least LinkedIn to look for the common threads between all the reviews, and that gives you a pretty good idea. Obviously, culture changes, and especially in the startup phase, it could change from 2 years to 2 months. So I think it's kind of important in the sense of like employee reviews. I see it more monumental in interview reviews to see, like, are they delivering a great candidate experience? And this is only from my perspective, where I love employer branding and really want to improve the candidate experience. And so it's like, are we delivering a great candidate experience? Is this what everyone's saying? And I think there's that notion of companies are like, oh, we have a great employer brand, or we have a great candidate experience. And then you're like, okay, great. Like, how are you measuring that? And they're like, oh, well, we just know. And you're like, okay, well, you're not relying on anything. You're not relying on what Glassdoor is telling you. You're not relying on your own surveys. Like, Qualtrics has been a great source to measure that. So I think Glassdoor has been a bit less prominent, if that makes sense, in recent years. I still think it's quite prominent in the sense it's still the only place to go to get a good overview of your company. But yeah, people are more likely going to leave a bad review than a positive review. But at the same time, too, you can't focus on that. You just kind of have to find the common threads between it all, and that kind of really tells the outside viewers what that culture is like.
Yeah. And I think you can do a little as an organization to try to encourage people to share their positive experiences, because you're right, you're only going to capture the ones that are like really angry and doing it in a kind of vengeful way, or the ones that really, really, really love it. And actually the truth sits in the middle, and often those people aren't driven to do it. So I suppose as a company trying to in some way drive people to put a review, whatever that may be.
And I think it's one of those things too, where like you have to be cautious about your wording and don't be tone deaf. Because I've seen companies are like, oh, hey, like, can you go write a positive review for us in Glassdoor? And that backfires so quickly because people are like, sure, yeah, I'll go do it. And then they'll go on Glassdoor, rate it 1 star, and say, here's the positive review or I'm writing the positive review that you wanted. But in reality, like, all these are fake 5 stars because you're asking for positive reviews.
Yes.
So be cautious about your wording and don't ask for reviews. Just say, like, we want your honest opinion, and we listen to the feedback if you do. But yeah, like you mentioned, you could ask for it at any stage. Someone passes probation, or someone joins the company, ask them to leave an interview review, or someone passes probation, ask them to leave an honest review of their first 3 months. And I think you could do a leave a review once every year. So look at maybe on someone's anniversary, or after someone gets promoted or takes on new leadership responsibility. So I think it's easy to do, but again, you got to be cautious of the wording.
Yeah. One of the ways I did it, I don't know if you'll think this is fair or not, but one of the ways I would do it is I would interview an employee, And I would do it in the format that Glassdoor usually asks for the review in. So like good things, bad things, how long you've been here, yeah, that same format. So I would ask them the questions and they would tell me truthfully how they felt, because I'm a third party. Why wouldn't they be honest with me?
Right.
And I would literally just type verbatim what they were telling me. And then I would email them later in the day and I would say, look, it was really great to spend some time with you. Thanks for sharing honestly your experience of working there. Look, what I've done below is I've just typed up exactly what you told me. If you feel like that's a really fair reflection of the conversation we had and you're happy to share it publicly, here's the link to the company's Glassdoor. All you've literally got to do is copy, click, paste, done. And it really helped people. It made it so easy for them. And it wasn't inauthentic. It wasn't untrue. I hadn't pressured people to be positive when they didn't want to be. It was just taking the onus of actually going, it was taking an admin task off them and sharing what they told me. And so I suppose companies could do it similarly, in that if they're having their employer value proposition, their culture as being something that's constantly reviewed and talked about, then maybe in somebody's one-to-one, when you're saying, so what is your honest opinion of working here? You can capture that, play it back to them and go, look, this is what you told me in our one-to-one. If you think that feels fair and you think that's a fair reflection and you want to post that, that would be amazing, but please don't feel like you have to. And then would that be a fair, I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, my 10-year experience would say don't ask for feedback on the company in a one-to-one. That always come back to bite you. But I think, like right now, I don't see any holes in it besides that. Like, I think it's a great, especially for small companies who don't, everyone's pulling more than 100% of their weight. They're doing, 120, 150. I think it's a great way to, like you mentioned, take it off the weight of them to craft something. Like, it's already written out. You just have to go in and post it or change it a bit. At the same time too, like, think about it from different lines. It's also a great way, again, to do double justice by using that as our EVP research to say, like, this is what you've told us works, what doesn't work, in your advice to management. Like, we're going to integrate this into the EVP to really drive a culture and value proposition that really speaks to everyone. And we want it to be honest and authentic. We don't want it to be inauthentic. So I think it does that double justice of killing two birds with one stone, of like gathering reviews at the same time doing the research. But sorry, think about it now. I think the only issue with that is having, like, if you have a 10-person team, you do it all in 1 week, you have all these reviews staggered in 1 week.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think that's the only, that in the one-to-one piece. But yeah, I mean, like, you could have like a Glassdoor campaign where you can just ask people over 3 months to post the reviews and staggered approach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And very interesting point where you said don't ask about company culture in a one-to-one. Tell me why.
I think, I've had experiences, and I think everyone has experiences. I think you kind of have to, a lot of companies say, like, come as you are and be who you are. And I don't think that's genuine in that sense. And, they mean well, but at the same time too, you think of people who have disabilities who are afraid to speak up because they fear getting, called out or dismissed or unfair dismissal. You think about people who are becoming parents who are afraid of sharing their pregnancy status because, they don't want to have any ill treatment. They don't want to be harassed. They don't want to be losing their jobs per se. And so I think we have to create more of a better culture in the world in terms of, not being afraid to speak out and sharing your experiences, and then having those consequences. If someone speaks up and says, hey, this person is harassing me, if you're the one speaking up, you're more often than not going to be the next one to be dismissed. Like, it's unfortunate, that's the reality. And so I think unless you're starting your career, I think we can all say that you really had to be protective of, like, what you're saying. And I think that's unfair to a lot of people who really want to change the culture.
Yeah, that's very fair, because I suppose in a one-to-one, by its very nature, is somebody having a meeting with the person above them. So there is default a power dynamic and a power imbalance in that room. And so for the one that holds the power imbalance to say to the other one, what's it like working here? Yeah, you're right. This is the wrong forum, because you're never going to get the truth, because people feel a bit too threatened. Yeah. And as the business grows, so we talked, those very early days, obviously this is going to be very founder led, I would imagine, in the very, very earliest days of a company. as a company starts to grow and evolve, where should this sit? And I mean, ultimately, it should probably sit with a people team, but it takes a little while, I suppose, for a company to get to a size where that is a division in and of itself. So, yeah, who should own this? How often should a company revisit it and reflect on it and rework this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, who should own it is like the question of the century, essentially. Like, there's always this whole, you could split our industry up into two and say, are you team marketing? Are you team people and culture? And I think this went on for a while. And I think the greatest answer to that is it doesn't matter, like, as long as you're connecting to both teams. Because I've sat within people and culture and had like immense access to data that the marketing team wouldn't be able to provide me or understand. And then I've also sat within marketing and kind of knew what employer branding was, but people and culture like didn't, and they didn't see how it connected to, employer branding connected to people and culture. So it was like this whole like whose side's better type thing. Personally, like I find it's a stronger connection with people and culture. And again, like it shouldn't matter as long as you have a connection to both. Like you want to be the bridge. Like if you're a river, you want to be that bridge with people and culture on one side and marketing on the other. But I think in the early stages, it's going to be scrappy. You're obviously won't see the results you're after. Employer branding is a long-term game, and even the most established companies, it's a marathon and not a sprint. And I think once you have the wiggle room to bring on more people and culture staff and their scope increases beyond hiring, then I think that's when you should really revisit it, as it really won't be a reality anymore. It's, again, culture changes so drastically in startups. And otherwise, it's too time intensive to change as you move through different stages of growth.
Yeah.
So I mean, people might hate on me for choosing people on culture, but I think, employer branding really fluctuates between the two. And at the end of the day, it's like where you get the most stakeholder buy-in from the C-suites. I think that's the biggest driver, and who has the most resources and budget and time and support that they can provide you with.
Yeah. And I guess until you reach such time as people and culture is a department that exists and you can give this to, would it be too much to say that I think actually, and this would maybe be my opinion, but I've literally just thought of it, so I'll hold this opinion lightly. Would it be too much to say that actually when your board, your leadership team are getting together, your C-suite team are getting together for their regular meetings, that perhaps this should be something, employee value proposition, employee experience, what does it look and feel like to work here, should be an item, where we're reviewing our product, where we're reviewing our tech roadmap, where we're reviewing our funding, like all of these things that are getting talked about at the board meeting. Should this not be one of them? And often it's not. Often we talk about, and I've sat in many a board meeting where people are talked about in terms of what they're producing and what they're doing and who's performing and who isn't. But people are never really talked about in terms of what's our part in that as a business. And are we creating a culture that people are going to be working well in and want to work well in?
Yeah, this is a really great idea, and I don't know why I didn't think about it earlier. I think it's a great idea because think about it, like and going back to the previous question, why I don't speak up, or anyone should really, I don't really believe speaking up in one-to-one is really the best idea, is because at the end of the day, layoff or not, you're a number. You're a number on the company spreadsheet. Like you have a salary, you have a number, employee number, and that's how you're seen. And I think bringing EVP and EB up within these board level meetings, I think it takes away the notion of people as an easily disposable product and places more on the emphasis of the value they can bring if they feel safe and secure. And so, every time you go to the board level meeting or C-suite meeting, it's like, oh, employer brand needs something from us, or they need to do this, or they need to do this. And it takes away the notion of what value does it bring. So it sees more of just like another task item. Where I think with your approach, it's a great idea to intertwine in. So it's more of like a long-term, like, we're going to need people in the future. Like, what can we do to get there? And how can we retain employees we have? And so they see it more of a long-term game of like, we want to be a great employer for A, B, and C, not everyone. And we need to think about this on an all the time basis, just as much as to think about profit on an all the time basis.
Totally. Yeah. Good. Okay. I'm glad that very hastily thought of thing that I threw out there holds some merit. Good. Perfect. I mean, I have about a million more things I could ask you, Graham, but I think you and I could talk about this all day, actually. But I won't keep you any longer. I will just leave by asking what final tips, or if there's kind of one thing that you could leave early stage founders with that maybe they could start doing this week that would be a step in the right direction, what would it be?
Yeah, I think first off, set aside some time, really take Disseminate, so DSM and 8's employee advocacy course, and read the book Employee Advocacy 101. It really will teach the basics of brand advocacy and how to get started, the value of it, and how to drive results. So it'll help you build your product brand and your employer brand at the same time. And then I think additionally, like, check out what I mentioned earlier, John and Adam created OpenOrg.
Yes.
Review their resources, including their templates for community culture building, and really build out your first template in Notion. A great way to start out with is community culture through your open, transparent employee handbook. So I think those two things will really do you monumental justice. And if you have an extra free time over a half-hour coffee break, create a profile on LinkedIn and Glassdoor, just so you have something that's on brand and is SEO friendly. And yeah, I mean, I think it's just as easy as that. And maybe you have another half-hour coffee break, like just come up with your first post and start sharing on LinkedIn and kind of get into the habit of doing that. I think all four of those things can really drive great value from an employer brand standpoint.
Amazing. Perfect. And we'll share all the links to all the things that we've referenced and talked about in the show notes and in the comments. So yeah, but that's it. You've been set your homework, founders. So go do your reading. Graham, thank you so much for spending what is my lunchtime, but what I understand is your early morning with me today. Really, really massively appreciate it, and the insights and value that you've given today, I hope will be very useful to a lot of people listening. So thank you so much, and thank you everybody for listening.